Hi, my friends, and welcome back to Authentically ADHD. I know I've been a bit MIA this year, and I just wanted to say thank you to my OG listeners who have stuck with me, the new listeners that we have now, and all of you in between for sticking with me throughout a pretty difficult season of my life. But now I am officially in summer and the content should be flowing. If you're new here, I would like to introduce myself. I am Carmen. I'm a late diagnosed ADHD adult with a side of self diagnosis of autism. I am an early childhood special education teacher. I've been doing that for 9 years. And I'm also a certified neurodevelopmental coach and blogger and podcaster and tutor. Long story short, I wear a lot of hats. Now, I started this podcast to help others because let's be real about it. The research on neurodivergence, especially in women, is pretty scarce. So I decided that I know how to research and I can use other people's research to help other people who are neurodivergent because pills don't teach skills. And a lot of the times, what I hear when people go and they get their diagnosis is that their doctor just hands them, some meds and then sends them on their way. But that's not the whole story because ADHD is a lot more than just keeping your attention where it needs to be. And we don't get me wrong here. We have no deficit in attention at all. ADHD, attention deficit disorder, is hyperactivity disorder. It's a terrible name because if you were to ask anybody, I was not a hyperactive child. Now, the fact that I could never answer the reason why do you always play with your hair, and now I can be like, because when there's nothing to do with my hands, that's what I do. It's my hyperactivity. So, today, the topic that we're going to zoom in on is one that I never knew that I needed so much, and that's self trust after ADHD. Why you don't believe yourself anymore. So, what if you're not indecisive? What if you're not dramatic? What if you're not too sensitive, too much, bad at life, inconsistent, unreliable, or just making excuses? What if you have been trained slowly, repeatedly, and painfully not to trust your own nervous system? Because that's what happens to a lot of late diagnosed ADHD, autistic, and AuDHD adults. We don't wake up one day magically unable to make decisions. It's a learned behavior. We learn it when we say, "This is too loud," and someone says, "It's not that bad." We learn it when we say, "I forgot," and someone says, "No, you didn't. You just didn't care enough." We learn it when we say, "I'm overwhelmed," and someone else says, "Everyone's overwhelmed." We learn it when our internal experience gets cross examined like we're on trial for crimes against productivity. And eventually, we stop asking, "What do I feel?" and we start asking, "What am I supposed to feel?" We stop asking, "What do I need?" and we start asking, "What would make me look normal?" And that, my friend, is not self growth. That is nervous system outsourcing with a side of emotional customer service. So, today we're talking about self trust after ADHD, especially for the late diagnosed neurodivergent adults. Why do we lose it? Why diagnosis can shake our identity like an etch a sketch? And how to begin rebuilding the kind of trust where you no longer need a committee meeting and then 3 screenshots and a blood sacrifice to decide whether you're allowed to rest or not. So, self-trust. It's not necessarily confidence. It's one of those topics that feels simple until you touch it and realize that it has a ton of emotional tentacles. It's self-trust. It's not confidence. It's not self-esteem in the way of say affirmations in the mirror while your laundry becomes sentient. It's like a deep internal ability to say, I believe myself, I trust myself, I can listen to my body, I can make decisions without abandoning myself. I can be wrong without turning it into a character assassination. I can need support and still be competent. I can have ADHD and still be a trustworthy narrator of my own life. Because for a lot of us, especially those of us that were diagnosed later in life, self trust is not just low, it has been through a war. Research is finally catching up with what many late diagnosed neurodivergent adults already know in their bones. A diagnosis in adulthood can trigger a major identity reconstruction. A 2026 systematic review looked at identity reconstruction in adults diagnosed with autism and or ADHD later in life and found themes like reconfiguring the self, finding the self through others, emotional integration, grief, internalized stigma, negative self-perception, external validation, empowerment, and reinterpreting the past. In other words, diagnosis is not just a label, it's just a plot twist. It's the moment where your whole movie rewinds and suddenly the villain was not you are lazy, but the villain was you were unsupported, misunderstood, and forced to perform normal with a brain running a completely different operating system. And when that happens, it can feel freeing, but it can also feel devastating. Because now you're not just asking, what is ADHD? You're asking, who was I before everyone told me who I was? Which parts of me are actually me? Which parts am I masking? Which parts are trauma? Which parts are survival? And how do I trust myself in my entire life? Like I was told my perception was actually wrong. So let's get into it. First, we're going to focus on self-trust and how it's built through repeated validation. And we often got the opposite, just a clue in. Self-trust is not something that you're born with or doomed without. It develops through repetition. It's actually something that as children we learn, right? It's a developmental thing that we learn through childhood. We learn self-trust when our internal experiences are mirrored accurately. A child says, I'm scared, and a safe enough adult says, that makes sense. Let me help you feel safe. A child says, this is too hard, and a safe enough adult says, okay, let's break it down. A child says, I need a break, and a safe enough adult says, your body is telling you something. Let's listen. This is how the nervous system is supposed to learn. My signals matter. My body makes sense. My feelings are information. My limits are real. My needs are not moral failures. But many ADHD and AuDHD kids do not get that. Not because every adult is evil or even unsafe. They're not twirling a villain mustache in fluorescent classroom lighting. Often, these adults in our lives simply do not understand what they are seeing. They see inconsistent performance and they call it laziness. They see emotional intensity and call it dramatic. They see sensory overwhelm and call it an attitude. They see task paralysis and call it defiance. They see forgetfulness and they call it carelessness. See how this is kind of all about perception and how much we know and how much an adult knows about emotional intelligence. They see a child trying so hard to hold it together and then melting down when they finally cannot, and they say, where did that come from? It came from the volcano, Susan. It was not spontaneous. It had a full production schedule. Over time, this repeated mismatch teaches the neurodivergent child that something dangerous, that our internal reality is not reliable. And not because it actually isn't reliable, but because it is repeatedly corrected by people who are interpreting the outside behavior without understanding the inside experience. And when your inside experience is constantly debated, dismissed, minimized, moralized, you learn to disconnect from it. You learn to check the room before you check yourself. You ask yourself, is this feeling allowed? Is this need inconvenient? Will people be mad? Am I too much? Am I actually tired or am I just being lazy? Am I overwhelmed or am I just being dramatic? Do I need help or am I just making excuses? And that right there is the beginning of self abandonment. Not because you lack character, but because your nervous system adapted to your surroundings. So, ADHD then makes self trust harder because performance can be inconsistent. One of the cruelest parts of ADHD is inconsistency. You can do something beautifully one day and then stare at the same task the next day like it has started speaking in ancient cursed symbols. You can be in a brilliant crisis and completely defeated by an email. Now, you can organize an entire classroom, podcast, blog, an emotional support empire, and then lose your phone while you're holding it. And people love to use inconsistency as evidence against us. They say, well, you did it yesterday. You remembered it last time. Well, it seems like you can focus when you care. You're super smart, so you should be able to do this. You just need more discipline. Ugh, that just made me sick to even say those. It all sounds reasonable if you're viewing ADHD as a motivation issue, but ADHD is not just simply not trying. Like ADHD involves differences in executive functioning, attention regulation, motivation, emotional regulation, arousal regulation, and so much more. Research on arousal dysregulation suggests that difficulty regulating an internal activation state may contribute to higher level cognitive difficulties in ADHD. And this matters because self trust often gets damaged when our output changes and nobody explains why. If nobody tells you, your brain has variable access to skills depending on regulation, interest, stress, sleep, sensory overload, dopamine, hormones, novelty, and task demand. Then what story do you create? If nobody tells you that that's what's happening, you create the story that you are the problem. I must not care. I must be lazy, immature, unreliable, or broken. And when you believe that you're unreliable, you stop trusting your own intentions. And that's a huge part of this. A lot of ADHD adults are not just afraid that they will fail, they are afraid that they cannot trust themselves to follow through. And honestly, that fear makes sense when your entire life has been full of moments where your intention was real, but the execution kind of collapsed. You meant to text back. You meant to pay the bill. You meant to start earlier. You meant to bring the form. You meant to finish the project. You meant to be consistent. But ADHD often creates a gap between intention and action. And if nobody explains the neuroscience of that gap, like the doctor that just throws you the pills and says, go on your way, then shame moves in like a raccoon in the attic. It's loud and destructive. For late diagnosed adults, diagnosis often comes with a strange emotional cocktail: relief, grief, anger, validation, sadness, empowerment, confusion. A sudden urge to psychoanalyze your entire childhood while standing in the cereal aisle. A qualitative study of adults diagnosed with ADHD in adulthood found that diagnosis was often experienced as explaining a previously inexplicable life history, providing self knowledge, and changing how participants understood themselves and their lives. But it could also create a concern about identity, disappointment about lack of help, and grief over not being diagnosed earlier. And that is exactly the tension. A diagnosis can feel like someone finally handed you the right map after you've been trying to use one that was, written in Spanish and the wrong one for your entire life. But then you realize that you have been walking through the wrong terrain for decades, blaming yourself for not reading a map that was never made for your brain to understand. And that causes grief. Grief for the version of you who thought that you were stupid. Grief for the child who got called lazy. Grief for the teenager who learned to mask. Grief for the adult who overcompensated until their body became a haunted house with Wi-Fi. grief for relationships where you were misunderstood, grief for jobs where you were judged, grief for the years you spent trying to become someone your nervous system could never sustainably perform. And grief is not self pity. Grief is your brain updating the file. It's the moment where your nervous system says, wait, we were not defective. We were unsupported. And the realization is healing, but it can also hurt. But now you have to rebuild a relationship with yourself after years of being taught that you are not a trustworthy source. So, I just want to interject here and say that I do have a free guide in the show notes that will help you to rebuild this relationship with yourself. And it will help you get started. Let's just say that. So go there if you're kind of like a workbook person and you want like a guide to help you with your self trust. Back to the episode. So let's talk about masking. Masking is when you hide, suppress, compensate for, or camouflage neurodivergent traits to appear more acceptable, more typical, and more manageable. Less difficult. And masking can be adaptive. Let's be honest. Sometimes masking keeps us employed, safe, included, or less likely to be eaten alive by people who think professionalism means never have a nervous system or feeling. But long-term masking definitely has a cost. A 2026 narrative review on stigma and masking in ADHD discusses how masking behaviors can be shaped by criticism, reprimands, repeated failures, social difficulty, public stigma, and self-stigma. The review also notes that excessive masking can involve constant behavioral monitoring, emotional exhaustion, reduced self-efficacy, and lower well-being overall. That phrase, constant behavioral monitoring, is basically the neurodivergent Yelp review of being alive. Masking says, don't move like that. Don't talk too much. Don't interrupt. Don't show confusion. Don't ask for clarification. Don't stay still. Don't be intense. Don't seem sensitive. Don't need anything. Don't let them see how hard this is for you. And the more you mask, the more you learn to look outward for instructions. You stop asking, am I okay? And instead, you ask, do I look okay? You stop asking, do I understand? And you ask, can I fake understanding long enough to escape this conversation? You stop asking, do I need rest? And instead you ask, have I earned rest according to the invisible capitalism goblin in my head? Masking teaches us to become experts in other people's comfort and strangers to our own. And when you spend years prioritizing external acceptability over internal truth, self-trust doesn't disappear all at once. It erodes like a shoreline, like a phone battery at 3% while you're using GPS and pretending everything is fine. Now, let's bring in the emotional side. Many ADHD adults experience rejection sensitivity or intense emotional responses to perceived rejection, criticism, or failure. The APA has noted that emotional dysregulation is increasingly recognized as a part of ADHD. And some people with ADHD are especially sensitive to criticism or perceived rejection. There is also qualitative research showing that adults with ADHD describe rejection sensitivity as involving rumination, self-blame, and even physical distress after a perceived rejection. Now, rejection sensitivity is not just, I don't like being criticized. Nobody likes to be criticized. That's not a personality flaw. That's just being a human. But for our ADHD brains, especially brains with a long history of being corrected, misunderstood, excluded, or shamed, that criticism can now feel like a threat in our brain, not feedback, a threat. And once your nervous system codes that correction as danger, decision making becomes terrifying because every decision now carries emotional risk. What if I choose wrong? What if they're disappointed? What if I'm misunderstood? What if I'm too much? What if I'm not enough? What if I trust myself and it backfires? What if everyone sees that I don't actually know what I'm doing? So we start crowdsourcing our reality. We ask friends, partners, coworkers, TikTok, Reddit, the group chat's emotional support group chat, our therapist, our notes app, and one random stranger named Brenda who had a strong opinion in 2014. And yes, community can be helpful, but there's a huge difference between seeking support and outsourcing your entire sense of reality. Support says, "Can you help me think this through?" Outsourcing says, "Please tell me what I'm allowed to feel." Did that not sound ridiculous to you? Asking somebody else, "Please tell me what I am allowed to feel." You should not have to ask somebody that. Support says, "I value your perspective." And outsourcing says, "I don't trust mine." And that is the wound. So if you're wondering, like, does self esteem even have to do with this then? Like confidence? I don't get it. So, self trust and self esteem are cousins. They're not twins or siblings, but they're cousins. They're definitely in the same family. And self esteem is often about how you value yourself, self trust is about whether you believe yourself. And research suggests that adults with ADHD often struggle with self esteem. A 2024 review of studies using the Rosenberg self esteem scale found that 5 of 6 studies with healthy controls reported lower self esteem in participants with ADHD. And ADHD symptoms were negatively correlated with self esteem. That matters because if you have low self esteem, that makes self trust harder. If I secretly believe I am incompetent, I will question every decision I make. If I secretly believe I'm too much, I will over edit my needs. If I secretly believe that I am unreliable, I will mistrust my intentions. And if I secretly believe that I'm always the problem, I will apologize before I even know what happened. And listen, some of us have been apologizing for existing in rooms where all we did was have a sensory system. Like, sorry, I'm blinking. Sorry, I have needs. Sorry, my nervous system has entered the chat with a chair and a fog machine. But this is why the identity repair matters, because you cannot productivity hack your way out of a self concept wound. You can buy the planner. You can color code the calendar. You can set the alarms, put sticky notes on every surface. But deep down, if you still believe I cannot trust myself, then every system becomes another courtroom, another way to prove that you're failing, another way to collect evidence against yourself. So, healing self trust is not just about making better decisions, it's about changing the relationship that you have with your own mind. I think this is why this is the topic I never knew I needed. I didn't know the neuroscience behind all of this and why this happens. And when I learned about it, oh my God, my life has changed in so many ways. So, real quick, we're going to talk about the brain science of this all. ADHD is strongly tied to executive functioning differences, things like inhibition, working memory, planning, shifting attention, emotional regulation, and sustaining effort. These are not just skills, but they're brain based processes. When executive function is inconsistent, your lived experience becomes inconsistent. You might not know, or you might know what to do and still not be able to access the steps. You might care deeply, but still forget. You might understand the consequences and still freeze. You may want to start and still feel physically unable to move. Research on emotional dysregulation in ADHD implicates brain systems involving the amygdala, ventral striatum, and orbital frontal cortex. Yeah, don't make fun of me if I mess that up. These areas are involved in emotional salience, reward, motivation, and regulation. So when we talk about self trust, we're not just talking about a mindset. We're talking about a nervous system that has learned to expect failure, criticism, overload, or rejection. And when your nervous system expects danger, it will often choose familiar survival patterns over authentic self leadership. Some of these patterns might sound familiar and they look like people pleasing, over explaining, over apologizing, avoiding decisions, letting others choose all the time, needing reassurance, not resting until you collapse, ignoring sensory needs until you become a human smoke alarm, saying yes while your soul quietly files a complaint. And this is why just trust yourself is not enough. It's like telling someone with a broken ankle, have you considered walking with more confidence? Cute, useless, and possibly a hate crime. I don't know. Self trust is something that has to be rebuilt through repeated nervous system experiences of safety, accuracy, and follow through. Not perfection, follow through. There is a difference. So, why do you feel like you don't believe yourself anymore? Let's name it plainly. You may not believe yourself because you were corrected more than you were understood. You were praised for masking and criticized for needing support. You were told that your best was not enough because people confused inconsistent output with inconsistent effort. You were taught that your emotions were too big instead of being taught how to regulate them. And you were punished for symptoms before anyone knew they were symptoms. You were called lazy when you were overwhelmed. You were called careless when your working memory dropped the ball. And you were called selfish when you missed social cues. You were called dramatic when your body was overloaded. You were called irresponsible when your executive functioning was offline. And eventually, your brain made an adaptation. Other people must know me better than me. That adaptation may have protected you at one point. If you were a kid in a classroom, family, culture, workplace, or relationship where your internal reality was not safe to express, outsourcing your reality may have helped you survive. But what protects us in one season can imprison us in another. At some point, the mask becomes too expensive. At some point, the over explaining becomes exhausting. And at some point, the self doubt becomes louder than your actual life. And at some point, your body says, I cannot keep abandoning myself to make everyone else around me comfortable. And that's where identity repair begins. Not with a giant declaration, not with I am healed now energy. More like maybe I am allowed to believe myself. Tiny, radical, terrifying, but it works. Diagnosis does not actually automatically restore self-trust, and here's the part that people really don't talk about enough. Getting diagnosed does not automatically make you trust yourself. Sometimes diagnosis gives you language, it can give you relief, and it can sometimes give you access to medication, accommodations, therapy, coaching, community, and a whole new understanding of your brain. But it does not instantly erase the decades of internalized shame. The 2026 systematic review on late diagnosed autistic and ADHD adults found diagnosis can be transformative and empowering, but the identity reconstruction process can also involve grief, internalized stigma, confusion, and negative self perceptions. That means after diagnosis, you may still ask, why am I using my ADHD as an excuse? Was I really struggling or am I just weak? Do I really deserve these accommodations? Can I trust my limits? What if I'm wrong? What if I'm not actually neurodivergent enough? What if I made it all up? The last one is so common in late diagnosed adults. Imposter syndrome shows up wearing a little lab coat like, hello, I have reviewed your suffering and I've concluded that you're probably faking. First of all, that's rude. Second of all, people who are faking usually are not spending years researching, grieving, questioning, masking, burning out, and building elaborate compensation systems just to survive daily life. Late diagnosis often gives us the explanation, but then we have to do the integration. And integration means taking the diagnosis out of the doctor's office and letting it rewrite the shame based stories that we've been carrying, not as an excuse, as accuracy. And there's a difference between excusing behavior and accurately understanding it. Accuracy says this was a symptom, this was a support need, this was sensory overload, this was executive dysfunction, this was rejection sensitivity, this was masking, this was burnout, this was not a moral failure. And when you become more accurate, you become less cruel. And that is the goal. Not perfect self trust, but less self betrayal. And as I said before we jump into the top 5 strategies to rebuild self trust after ADHD, check out the workbook in the show notes. It can really help when you see these things down on paper. So let's get practical because, yes, we love a neuroscience spiral, but eventually we want to return to the mortal realm and answer emails. So I have gathered, in my opinion, the top 5 strategies to rebuild self trust after ADHD diagnosis. Number 1, start a self trust evidence log, not a gratitude journal, not a good vibes only notebook, and absolutely not a toxic positivity workbook or whatever. A self trust evidence log is where you collect proof that you can listen to yourself and survive, because your brain may currently have a giant archive called Times I Messed Up, the extended director's cut. So we need to build a competing archive. Write down tiny moments like I noticed I was overstimulated and put in my headphones. I stopped working before I hit shutdown. I asked for clarification instead of pretending I understood. I made the decision without polling 6 different people. I rested even though the guilt goblin had some notes for me. I forgot something and repaired it without verbally assaulting myself. I honored my limit. I changed my mind. I trusted a body signal. This works because self trust is rebuilt through repeated evidence, not affirmations you don't believe. Evidence. Your nervous system needs receipts, so give it to them. Tiny, boring, but beautiful receipts. Number 2, replace am I allowed with what is true. A lot of us ask permission based questions like, and we may not even realize we're doing this, but we're asking things like, am I allowed to be tired? Am I allowed to say no? Am I allowed to need help? Am I allowed to be upset? Am I allowed to leave? Am I allowed to make this easier for myself? And those questions are rooted in external approval. Instead, we're going to practice some truth based questions. What is my body telling me? What is the actual demand here? What support would make this possible? What am I afraid will happen if I believe myself? What do I know right now? And what is the next easiest, honest first step? This shifts you from performance mode to self leadership. You are not asking the invisible jury for permission, you're gathering data. And as neurodivergent people, we often tend to make our internal data more visible. Because if it stays vague, shame will interpret it. So name the data. I have a headache. My chest feels tight. I am rereading the same sentence. I feel irritated by that sound. I'm avoiding this because I don't know the first step. I am not lazy. I am unclear, overloaded, undersupported, or understimulated. That is self trust, not always knowing, but believing your body and listening accurately. Number 3, make smaller promises to yourself. And this one is huge. A lot of ADHD adults do not trust themselves because they have a history of making giant promises during dopamine surges, like, I'm going to clean the entire house. I'm going to wake up at 5 a.m. every day. I'm going to meal prep for the next 3 weeks. I'm going to fix my whole life by this Sunday. I'm going to become a different human by Tuesday. Respectfully, no, that is not a plan. All of that is fantasy. It is dopamine hallucination with a Canva template, okay? Self trust grows when you make promises that are small enough that you can keep. Not impressive promises, keepable promises. So try it out this way. I will put one dish in the sink. I will open the document. I will set the timer for 5 minutes. I will put my shoes by the door. I will send a text that says, I'll reply more fully later. I will take out one bag of trash. I will rest for 10 minutes without turning into a self-improvement project. Every kept promise tells your nervous system, we do what we say in accessible ways. And that last part matters. Accessible follow through builds self trust. Impossible standards destroy self trust. Number 4, stop using shame as a project manager. Please, please, I'm begging you to stop. A lot of us use shame to function because that's what we were trained to do. That's what we learned. It's how we grew up. But we can stop now. Because shame says you better do this or everyone will know you're a disaster. You better overperform or they'll leave. You better mask or they'll reject you. You better say yes or they'll be disappointed. You better not rest or you will fall behind. And shame can create short term movement, but it is so expensive. It is like paying rent with your nervous system, and eventually the bill comes due. Instead of shame, try neutral structure. So instead of I'm pathetic if I don't do this, try this task needs a container of time. Instead of I should be able to handle this, try what supports does this task require. Instead of why am I like this, try what is the barrier. Instead of I always ruin everything, try what is the repair. See how it's not letting yourself off the hook? It's using a better hook. Shame is a rusty hook, and we're upgrading. Strategy, last but not least, number 5, build a safe mirror system. Self-trust does not mean you never need people. That's hyper-independence wearing a trench coat. Humans do need mirrors, and neurodivergent humans especially need safe mirrors because so many of us grew up with distorted mirrors. A safe mirror is someone who helps you hear yourself more clearly, not someone who replaces your voice. A self a safe mirror says, that makes sense. Or let's separate the facts from the fear. What does your body say? What supports do you need? You're allowed to take up space. You can make this smaller. You can repair this. You're not bad. You're dysregulated. This could be a therapist, coach, trusted friend, partner, neurodivergent community, support group, or even your own written reflection practice. The key is this: choose mirrors that return you to yourself, not mirrors that make you perform, not people who treat your diagnosis like an excuse, not people who require a 17-slide presentation before believing you, and not people who only validate you when your needs are convenient. Safe support should strengthen self-trust, not replace it. So let's come back to the question that we started with. What if you're not indecisive? What if you've just been trained not to trust your own nervous system? What if all those years of masking, correction, rejection, and being misunderstood taught you to outsource your reality? And what if healing is not becoming a brand new person? What if healing is coming back to the person that you were the whole time? They were there, buried under shame, coping, over explaining, and the emotional debris of being misread. Because self trust after ADHD is not about becoming perfectly confident. It's not about never needing reassurance. And it's not about making every decision correctly. It's about building a relationship with yourself where your first instinct is no longer self suspicion. It's being able to say, I believe that I'm tired. I believe that this is hard. I believe that I need support. I believe that my emotions are information. I believe that my body is not lying to me. I believe that I can make mistakes and still be trustworthy. I believe that I can repair. I believe that I can learn myself again. Because you are not unreliable. You are recovering from years of being misinterpreted. You're not broken. You're rebuilding the bridge between your brain, your body, and your identity. And yes, maybe the bridge is currently made of sticky notes, caffeine, nervous laughter, and one suspiciously emotional playlist, but it's still a bridge. And every time you listen to yourself, instead of immediately abandoning yourself, you lay down another plank. And that's the work, my friend. Tiny plank by tiny plank until one day you realize that you are not asking everyone else if your life is real. You are living from the inside again. And that, my friend, is the work. It's not shiny, it's not linear, it's not Instagram perfect, but it's real. And real is where self-trust begins. As always, this episode is for education and support, not medical advice. If this brought up grief, trauma, or that, oh no, I need to stare at a wall and rethink my entire life feeling, please be gentle with yourself. See a professional if you need to. Late diagnosis can be validating and destabilizing at the same time. You're allowed to need support. You're allowed to grieve. You're allowed to be angry, and you're allowed to rebuild slowly. And you are absolutely allowed to stop treating your nervous system like an unreliable narrator just because other people never learned how to read the story. So until next time, stay authentic, and we will talk soon, my friends. Just a small note for anybody who listens to me through any platform. I have switched my publishing platform to Substack. It is one of my favorite new apps, and this is why. You can post anything that you would like to post on another platform, videos, regular posts, and even lengthen posts like blogs. And I have tons more information and resources on my Substack blog. It'll be in the show notes of this episode if you want to check it out. Alrighty, my friends, that's all for now. We'll talk soon.